1999 Volkswagen Passat, Serpentine belt. You got some busy work getting some plastic covers off. One of the first real mechanical steps of replacing the Serpentine or main drive belt is to remove the air conditioning belt. That's pretty easy to do. You just basically loosen two 13mm bolts on the fixed tensioner and it'll move up out of the way. That belt will just slide right off and get that out of the way. There's some pretty good videos out there that show how to replace the Serpentine belt, and they get into detail about how to loosen the tensioner and so on, so you can check those out as well. You don't have to take this tensioner off, but we wanted to take it off and see if it was good. Just these 3 bolts here would work really nice to have a ratcheting wrench for that. You can see inside there it does not look centered. There may be an issue with that. The pulley spins okay. On this side we're flush. On this side there's a gap. It looks like it may have popped out a little bit. Everything is super tight up in here. This is a belt tensioner right here. There's 2 bolts. One bolt you can see right there in the middle of the screen. The other bolt is hidden behind the 17mm lug that you use to move the tensioner. I've got my ratchet on there right now. It's very hard to see, but it's up in there. On the tensioner, that may look like there's supposed to be a bolt in there, but there's not. We've got the new one on. I know you hate videos where it's like, yeah, this is what we did, but it's impossible to really film this, but one of the harder parts was getting the new belt over the front pulley and onto the back one and past this tensioner. Now if I would have taken both bolts on the tensioner off, it would have been super easy, but the top bolt to that tensioner is a real bear to get to, and I was afraid if I took it off I couldn't even get my hand up in there to get it started again. So we just had one guy on top, me down on the bottom, and I just took a screwdriver and I kind of pushed while he pulled and wiggled, and we got that belt to slip through the gap between the pulley and the tensioner, and then after that everything was pretty much straightforward. Now we're thinking we've got a bad tensioner because that belt is not riding in line with that tensioner pulley. So that last belt we had got cut in half, and you can kind of see why that might happen. That last 1/8 of an inch towards the top, will eventually shred out of there. So I think what's happened is this thing's come apart enough that it's cocked, and of course it's not aligning with that. So we need a new tensioner. There's a good video on how to replace that. It's just these 3 bolts, pretty straightforward. 17mm wrench on that thing to pull the tension off. 3 13mm bolts. You want to have one of those ratcheting 13mm boxed in wrenches to get those out of there and make it a lot easier. You can see here on the fan clutch, or the fan pulley, how that belt lines up a lot better with that pulley, and it's shiny pretty much from front to back on that pulley. There's a lot of jumping around there. That doesn't seem right. We just cut this old belt with some side cutters to get it out of there, but you can see how it split into two pieces. Today we're going to be working on a 1999 Volkswagen Passat, a 1.8 liter 4-cylinder with a turbo and air conditioning. This started out as the replacement of a Serpentine belt, but also turned into the replacement of the main drive belt tensioner. Volkswagen calls the Serpentine belt a main drive belt. The main drive belt tensioner is a typical spring-loaded type tensioner like I'm used to seeing on other cars that applies varying pressure based on the stretch that you see in the belt. So it self-compensates and takes up the slack over the life of the belt as it increases its length. The particular car that we're working on today has 3 belts. One, the Serpentine belt, or as they call it, the main drive belt, which is the longest. It goes around the crankshaft, the power steering pump, and the alternator. There's another belt that goes around the air conditioner, the crankshaft, and a fixed tensioner. And there's also a third belt which goes around the water pump and around the power steering pump pulley. That particular belt that goes around the water pump and the power steering pump pulley is a pain to replace. It's very odd in that it has no tensioner for that particular belt. It's a short belt. The problem you run into with that is because it has no tensioner, if the belt is stretched, you may be able to get it off by kind of prying it over the pulley, but when you try and put the new belt on, it's just not going to fit, and if it does, it's going to be too loose. This particular design actually has a split pulley, so you have to actually take a couple of bolts out and break that pulley. One of the 2 pulleys is a split pulley. There's actually a couple of bolts in there you take off, and the pulley comes into 2 pieces. You then slip the belt over it, put the other half of the pulley back in there, rotate things around, get it on both sides, kind of adjust the slack, and then tighten those 2 bolts to make your pulley one round pulley again. So we're not going to do that today, but I thought I would mention that. That's a very strange belt. We did replace that belt about a year and a half ago or so with one from a auto parts store, and it was way too loose. So obviously it wasn't going to work. You don't want to have it slipping down there and not turning your water pump. So we actually went to the Volkswagen dealership, bought their belt, and it was noticeably shorter and does work for the application. The fixed tensioner on that AC belt that goes around the crankshaft, the air conditioner, and a fixed tensioner, the tensioner for that is held on by 2 bolts. In this case they were bolts. In another video by A1 Auto on a 2002 Passat, those 2 bolts are actually Allen head bolts. In this case though, they were both 13mm bolts. You don't have to take either one of the bolts loose. You basically just get them loose, maybe 1 turn or so, and that will allow that tensioner to move. One bolt is a pivot bolt. It just goes through a hole. The top bolt, which is very difficult to even see, you loosen that bolt, and that will allow the tensioner to slide back and forth in a slot to allow you to adjust the tension. But once you adjust that tension and tighten those bolts down, it's fixed. There's no spring to make up any slack over time. Also on that tensioner there's a nut molded into it, or you could think of it as a nut welded onto it, that allows you to slip something over it, and that's where you're going to crank on it and apply tension while you tighten down one or both of those two bolts that hold that tensioner in place. In this case that was a 17mm nut welded on there. It's very difficult. This entire car is very tight. Your space is very limited. So if you've got those 6mm Allen head screws that are holding on this tensioner, you're never going to get a ratchet with an Allen head attachment up in there. There's just absolutely not enough room. You're going to have to go with just a standard Allen wrench, ideally long handled or with some kind of a little cheater bar on it, and get up in there. In this case I was able to get a standard ratchet 3/8 inch drive with a 13mm socket up in there to get those two bolts on the tensioner loose and tight. For that 17mm nut that's molded into that tensioner, you're not going to be able to get a socket on a ratchet up in there, at least in this case certainly not. So you're going to want to have some kind of a special tool. In this case a serpentine belt tool works well, provided you have the car jacked up high enough. Sometimes that serpentine belt tool is so long you'll hit the ground before you get it to where you need it to be. But that serpentine belt tool is very thin. You can get a socket on there and you'll have the room then to get that up in there, get it over that molded nut on the tensioner, and you can torque on that to get it tight. You're going to want to have a 12-point socket, in this case 17mm socket, on that serpentine belt tool. That'll allow you to get a lot more angles that the tool will slip over the nut. It appeared that this particular year of Passat did have maybe a couple of options for belts, so I'd probably recommend that you go to the dealership with your VIN number and let them pick out the main drive belt / serpentine belt for you to make sure you get that right. For the water pump belt, you're going to want to go to the dealership and get that belt from them, because it's very critical that that be the right length, and some aftermarket belts have shown not to be the right length. So go to the dealership, get that belt if you need it. In this case, on this video, we're not going to put that on. I try not to make these videos where it's basically here's what we did and not show you the step-by-step process. But in this case I was helping out a friend. I had to go over to his house. We had a fairly limited time to get this replaced, so I just took a few clips here and there. To replace the serpentine belt or the main drive belt, you have to take the AC belt off first. There's a good video out there that shows how to do that. It's by A1 Auto. So if you watch that video, you'll see how to take the AC belt off. Then there's a couple other good videos out there on how to replace the serpentine belt. But hopefully some of the information in this video can kind of supplement that, and if you put everything together, you can turn this into a fairly reasonable job. It started out as, oh, I just need a serpentine belt. But when I got over there and looked at the serpentine belt that had failed, it was basically split into two pieces. And so we got to looking at the main drive belt tensioner, and it looked like it had some shiny metal on it. It just didn't quite look right. And so I was concerned there was something wrong with it. So we went ahead and we took that off, and once we got it off, you could see that it just didn't look right. There was some damage on the back side of it, and it appears what had happened is that something in there failed. It kind of came apart a little bit. That allowed the tensioner pulley to get somewhat cocked, and so the tensioner pulley was not riding over the belt completely, and some of the belt was basically hanging off of that tensioner pulley, and over time that basically just cut that belt in half. So this job turned into also replacing that main drive belt tensioner. And everything with this car, especially up in the front end, is so tight that it's almost impossible to get good video, to get good lighting in there to show you exactly what you're doing. So it's a little easier just to explain it and to kind of show you with a few pictures. That main drive belt tensioner is available at your Volkswagen dealership for around $190. It is also available on Amazon or at your local parts store for a lot cheaper than that. It's a fairly easy fix to replace that upper drive belt tensioner. There's a couple of good videos out there on that, so I'd refer you to those. Basically just 3 bolts that hold that on. To replace that upper main drive belt tensioner, you're going to want to have a 13mm ratcheting wrench, kind of a gear wrench type thing. It's going to really help you out. You can get it done with your standard box end, open end wrench, but you're going to make a lot of small turns there, and it's going to take a lot of time. So it'd be great if you could get one of them ratcheting gear wrench type setups there. It's going to make it a lot easier. The good news is you can slip the new Serpentine belt in without taking off that small belt that goes over the water pump and the power steering. So that's a big help because that belt's a pain to replace. One of the harder parts of getting that new Serpentine belt on was getting that belt to squeeze between the gap between the crankshaft pulley and the fixed tensioner for the AC belt. In this diagram it looks like you got a ton of room there, but in reality you got about an extra 10/1000ths over the width of that belt. So you kind of got to push it into that gap at a little bit of an angle. It helped. I had one guy up on top kind of pulling and wiggling, and I pushed on the belt with a screwdriver and got it through that gap. And that was probably the most difficult part of that. You could take that bottom fixed tensioner for the AC belt completely off, and it would make that a breeze of getting that new belt in there. However, my concern was that if I took the top bolt out of that fixed tensioner, it would be a real bear to get it back in there. Now if you need to do it, you need to do it. But if you can squeeze it in there without taking that bolt out, it may help you out, because it is super tight up in there, and I could not even get my hand up in there to get my fingers on that top bolt to give it a turn. So getting it to go back in there was a concern. If for some reason you just cannot get it and you have to take that fixed tensioner off for the AC belt, you have to do what you have to do, and then you'll just have to fight getting that top bolt started back in there and getting it tightened up. But if you can avoid taking that bottom tensioner off, it'd probably be to your advantage. We did not have to remove the fan. We were able to slip the belt over the fan, so avoided that step. If you ended up buying a new main drive belt tensioner, the one with the spring in it, that will usually come with a pin in there. So it's basically squeezed together and then they put a pin in it. I think the idea is that you can put it in there, get the belt over it, and then you can somehow reach in there, pull the pin, and it pops out and the tension shows up. But if you want to, you can pull that pin ahead of time, or if you're reusing the old one, just go ahead, get it in there. Then it's ideal if you can have someone help you. There is a lug on that tensioner that you can slip a 11/16 or 17mm wrench over. That allows you to gain some room to where you can slip the belt over the tensioner pulley and then slowly release it, and it'll apply that tension with the spring.